Kyle up here to start?
Yes. So welcome everybody to our panel on open cities and smarter citizens, which is organized by Patiro, an NGO based in Indonesia, Future Everything, an NGO based here in the UK in Manchester, and Data Uruguay. My name is Fabrizio Scrolini. I'm here to be the chairman of this amazing panel, a truly global panel on open cities. And today, I'm joined by a great lineup of speakers from the Global North and the Global South. And we hope that this dialogue contributes to a better understanding of how cities are evolving today. Essentially, as you can see, we have Pablo Collada from the City of Mexico, David Sasaki from Omedia Network, John Wanderlich from Sunlight Foundation, Andrew Hemmett for Future Everything, Silvana Fumega from the University of Tasmania, Marlene Steiker from Wax Society in the Netherlands, and Widyarthi Dajono from Patiro. So it's truly amazing to have them all here. And some basic housekeeping rules. I mean, like, as you can see, we have a large and truly global panel. So we will welcome participation, but I will be tough on timing. That also includes the speakers and panelists. And I usually mild, but I have no choice. And then essentially this session is also translated into Spanish, and we are also video streaming this session as well, and you can follow a hashtag in Twitter with the hashtag OpenCities. So without further introduction, I welcome Drew Hemmett from Future Everything.
Thank you, Fabrizio. Okay, so myself and Chris are going to give some short opening talks, and you'll notice some differing perspectives. I'm going to be speaking from the perspective of a small organization that's been working very much in a grassroots way with communities, with governments, with NGOs, with businesses around city development, around openness agenda. Whereas with Chris, we're going to hear from the World Bank's point of view. I'll also give a bit of an introduction to this session. So first of all, why cities? City scale has become increasingly significant. I do a lot of work, in particular in open data, and a lot of the really useful data is held at city level, a lot of the data that affects people's lives. Then, of course, we're very familiar with the growing significance of cities around the world, the majority of people living in cities. Interesting things about different scales of cities. I think we'll hear from Chris as well. And certainly relevant for me, working a lot in Manchester, medium-sized cities are significant because there's lots of them. And that's interesting too as well, because cities, and I think this panel speaks to that, provide a basis for a very international conversation. There's lots of connection points between people at the level of cities. So what we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at a range of approaches to opening up governance in cities, to supporting bottom-up social and business innovation, drawing on many things, developments in open source computing and the culture that spills out of that, and recent developments in open government. Now, I would argue that we face a really special opportunity right now, partly out of a number of crises. We've had economic crises, banking crises. We've got crises of trust in digital systems and in governments right now, with the disclosures around NSA, GCHQ. But there's also a crisis of ideas around cities and the future of cities. And I think there's an opportunity for forums like this and voices from different parts of the world like these to really shape that vision. I will just say Future Everything has released a publication to coincide with this event. It's called Smart Citizens. And if you're interested, it's at futureeverything.org, and you can find it there. So one of the reasons I say there's a crisis of ideas at the moment is one of the dominant narratives around the city is that of the smart city. And that is at a real interesting moment right now because there's a real impasse. The smart city vision has been really driven by the larger technology companies, and it's hit a bit of a crisis. We see in this vision a collision of two philosophies, two ways of thinking. In simple terms, the vision makes a lot of sense if you're used to the world of big infrastructure, top-down master planning, but that's collided with a very different space, the space of the city, which is messier. A lot more happens from the bottom up. And there's some fundamental issues with this vision. It's based on a command and control model about pulling in information and making the city more efficient. Well, that works very, very well for some things. It works well for traffic flows and for water supply, but it doesn't necessarily support innovation or the people. It misses the people. And what's happening is many cities around the world are really meeting an impasse where this collision of philosophies is holding everyone back. It's holding the grassroots innovators, the cities, the large corporates, and the corporates themselves know that they have a problem. The technology is not selling. So if I have any, I don't mean to pick out IBM at all. If we have any large corporates in the room, I would view this more as a counseling session rather than any kind of an assault. So what do smart cities look like? I think they look more like that. That's an event we held in Moscow just last week. It's about the people. And one of the key architects of this thinking of the smart citizen, which is a critical response to this smart city vision, is Dan Hill, who reminds us that the city is its people. But there's a lot of other really compelling ideas coming out of this space as well. Anthony Townsend talks about bespoke smart cities. So another issue with the very top-down vision of the smart city is it's generic. It's one size fits all. Well, how can we design local solutions? In technology design, a lot of the interesting work's around contextual design. So things that are relevant to places and to communities. But then how do those scale up? How can we can't create everything afresh, and we do need big infrastructure. So how do we take those things that can work in our context, and importantly, how can we trade and sell our solutions on a global market of social and business innovation? So I'll quickly walk you through a case study from Manchester, or based in Manchester. So I run Future Everything. I'm also an academic at Dundee University. And it's worth saying just quickly what Future Everything is, because Future Everything started 19 years ago as an arts organisation, a digital arts organisation. And we run a festival. We run the UK's Digital Culture Festival. But we use that as a research space. We draw on methodologies from computing, like living labs, and we use the space of the festival to prototype and test and experiment in different social innovations, technology innovations, different forms of city making. And it builds on a digital culture. It builds on open source digital culture. It builds on communities of practitioners who work collaboratively, who share their software openly in environments such as GitHub, and they make incredible artworks. More than making artworks, these people make the platforms that other people create with. And coming out of this, we work, for example, with the BBC on an initiative around cultural archives called the Digital Public Space, which has a very lofty ambition of putting all of recorded human history freely online for everyone to access. It doesn't take long to get to a few difficult rights issues which gets in the way of that. But so we're working on that, and then we've been very active in open data and very passionate about cities. So in Manchester, in 2009, we set ourselves a challenge. We asked ourselves, how can a city move towards adopting, in specific terms, an open data framework, and in general terms, openness? And it's important to note that we asked that question as a non-governmental, non-profit, cultural organisation. And we were interested in the city as a laboratory for new ways of living, playing, governing, new forms of citizenship. And so this was, in a sense, a form of citizen innovation. And we had a particular approach. Our approach was not top-down. We worked out as an external disruptor, and we addressed the entire ecosystem at once. So we dealt with the community of businesses and developers, we dealt with the listserv managers, we dealt with the executive, we dealt with the different city agencies, and we developed the ecosystem. We built the ecosystem. And a key part of that was community. Our vision was that sustainability comes through community. So we, in practical terms, what does that mean? We formed a group called Open Data Manchester, which is a group of sort of 50 to 60 people who meet every month. It's been going for 3 years, and a lot of spin-out businesses and products have come out of that. And that's significant because what that's done is it's proved the demand. It's created a demand case for open data. This community helps the local authorities decide which data sets to release and how. So it's become an essential part of the picture in Manchester. Through that, we set up the Greater Manchester Data Store in partnership with the local authorities. And we've run, over the last 4 years or so, a program of different forms of hackathons, which are about new forms of community intelligence, bottom-up solutions to local problems. A big challenge coming out of that is around the sustainability of those kind of projects. So we also look at the business side, the business of open data. And key is, especially in medium-sized cities, is developing a market of a sufficient scale to sustain this activity. So outside the likes of London and New York, it's essential for cities to collaborate. So we're in a number of European projects with people like Marlene from VAG Society, looking at creating the conditions for a Europe-wide market for open data applications. And we're also working with the Future Cities Catapult and the Connected Digital Economies Catapult on looking at new forms of horizontal peer support within the local authorities, between the local authorities and externally, to enable them to synchronize releases of data, so putting code fellows in there to help them work through those challenges, to enable that to take place and to scale up. We get involved in debates around this in the media, introducing the idea that community is king, and now working as a very external independent organization, we've now working very much in step with policy, particularly with the Open Data Institute, and we're a node now. The ODI has created a network of nodes, and we're now a node there. So, final point really is the big question, which I think we're going to hear different answers to, is how can we create opportunities to engage every citizen in the development and revitalization of smarter cities? Don't be afraid by the next slide, there's lots of text on there. Here's some principles. Now these are in the publication, these are an edited version of some of the points made in the publication, so please do look there. But the idea that agency is everywhere, it can't just be done in a top-down way, we have to engage everyone. Critically important right now, going back to the debate around smart cities, to intelligently combine the bottom-up and the top-down. And I'm seeing cities all around the world that I talk to having that problem. Embrace self-organisation and civic initiative, but help to make the results sustainable and scalable. Act global for local impact. And those have come from one of Frank Cresin's contributions and also one of mine to the Smart Citizens publication. So that's online. That's all from me. We're now going to hear we'll hear from Chris first, and then after that, we're going to hear from some different global perspectives on how cities are engaging in open government and empowering bottom-up social and technological innovation.
Thank you. Well, this is actually I've had the honor and pleasure of speaking 3 times at the summit. And at the first one, I made a rather rash statement. I said that I thought PowerPoint was evil and that I wasn't ever going to use it this week. And I'm going to go back on my word, and I do have a PowerPoint that I'm going to be speaking from. So for those of you who were at the session, please forgive me because I'm going to be evil. I guess that's okay on Halloween. Building smarter cities, that's the topic of the day. And, I think that the challenge when we talk about smarter cities is that oftentimes this is what we're dealing with. I work for the World Bank. We have 2 goals. One is to eradicate extreme poverty for those living on $1.25 a day or less, and raising the economic well-being of the bottom 40% of everybody else. Unfortunately, my customers oftentimes are faced with city infrastructure like this. Obviously, not all cities are developing equally. We know that urban population is growing. We've known that for some time. The majority of the Earth's inhabitants now live in cities. But interestingly enough, when you start looking at where they're starting to, where this trend is most prevalent, you see Asia and the Middle East as being most prevalent. But interestingly enough, while we know that people are moving to cities, was a surprise to me that it's actually not the large cities which get most of the publicity. It's actually the medium and small cities that are dealing with this issue the most. And they're probably even less likely to deal with the fundamental problem of rising expectations of the citizens and the ability of the city to actually meet those expectations. So, smart cities. And I even have to say that I'm not sure that I know I don't like the word smart cities, but it is unfortunately a term that's come to be used in the marketplace, and we haven't yet been able to come up with a better term. But I think, smart cities used to be cities like Songdo. They used to be cities like Singapore. Very top-down models, very financially expensive cities, investments, large investments. But what we're seeing now is other types of cities emerging where really we're talking about the bottom up. Helsinki, Barcelona, where citizens are actually becoming the human sensors of government to actually bring interesting data and knowledge into the city. So we're seeing this bottom up, leveraging existing technologies and much, much more affordable. And so really, if you see kind of the distinction between the two, you see the top-down and the bottom-up enabled by technology. So there are 4, I think, trends or 4 principles that are in existence to enable smart cities to truly, truly work. And I think the first is that the idea is that the city understands that it can't solve every problem itself. It has to become a platform. It has to make available to others its assets, what it brings to the table, so others can actually create the value that is needed within the city. There never will be enough time, there never will be enough technology, there never will be enough resources for a city to solve all of its problems. So then if a city becomes more of a platform and lets go and invites the citizens, the private sector, the civil society in, you end up with a capacity that you didn't have before. The smartest people aren't part of the city government, as much as that may be what they're trying for. And you get smart people from the community become the capacity and actually enable the work to be done. And what we've learned from Silicon Valley and other business startups is that we cannot forget that everything has to be focused on the citizen, and we need to design our products and services from a citizen-centric, a user-centric perspective. And lastly, it's all about empowerment. What this entire trend is about, and I would argue even the technology trends we're dealing with, is that it's all helping to empower the individual, and we need to support that empowerment, because in turn that brings us right back to the beginning of being able to enable the platform to work. So our proposed framework for smart cities, I'm going to talk about what we're doing in Colombia with 3 medium to small size cities. And what we did in Colombia was create a model that we're quite frankly testing out to see if it actually will work in South America. And the first is that we met with the government, academia, civil society organizations, and private sector, and just got them all to sit down and talk with each other, really for the first time, and to lay out some of the issues and to develop a draft roadmap, if you will, just a concept of what problems were in existence and really what they thought could be accomplished by working together. Simple, just getting everybody together and starting simple. Then we moved to identifying city priorities. So we created a baseline, and then we really worked with the various participants to come up with a detailed list of those priorities. And then we introduced things like hackathons into the concept, where we actually brought other people in and said, okay, the problem here is health. How are we going to solve this? What do we need? Do we need data? Do we need sensor networks? What do we need? And really create the conversation about what's needed to start amplifying and make better that initial plan. Then we actually started developing and co-creating the solutions. And so what we were able to do then is start showing value. All it takes generally is just one small application or one small change in how a business process is delivered by a city to excite people to the opportunity and to see the possibility of what could happen. And then we create something we call an urban living lab, where in order to sustain this energy and to sustain the development and operation of many of these tools, products, and services, we needed to bring all participants together and enable them to really become that lab, that place where experimentation can happen and actually change take place. And last, we plugged those cities into networks of other cities that are doing interesting things, European Network of Living Labs, City Kit, Open Cities, just to make sure that we were supporting them and getting that constant flow of new information, new ideas into the mix. So in kind of closing, what we're trying to do is understand that cities are ecosystems, as was said, and trying to figure out how to bring the various parts of that ecosystem together to support them and build them, to create sustainability, but actually to also figure out how to embed the technology, not as primary, but as secondary in making sure that this all works. And that's my 10 minutes. Thanks.
Thank you very much to both speakers. We would like now essentially ask the public if there's any question, any thought, any comment that you, and there's one gentleman at the back. It has to be relatively short.
My name's William Perrin from the Indigo Trust and Talk About Local, and I do a huge amount of civic action in cities in the UK. I'm a big fan of the open data movement. But what I don't see happening anywhere in the world is cities you can point to where millions of citizens are benefiting from the smartness of the city and their daily lives are being made measurably better. The Smart Cities agenda hasn't really delivered in volume in the vast majority of places where it's been claimed or has been deployed. And I think that's a great shame. But even the diagrams that the speakers have shown so far have not really been citizen-driven. tends to start with the technology rather than starting with the citizen. I just wondered if anyone had any observations on how we can deliver large-scale benefits to citizens through smartness of cities, things that change people's daily lives.
Thank you very much. Drew, Chris?
Yeah, well, firstly, I would separate the smart city agenda from the open data agenda myself. I think I've just come off the ODI summit early this week. Seems to be a week for summits, and we've been presented examples from around the world of open data having transformational impacts. But not always sometimes in things that are almost beneath the radar, but when you realize what the impact they have, it's significant. There was a case in banking of complaints being made publicly available, which sounds like a nightmare for the banks. But actually what happened is those banks, the 4 major banks, started using that to benchmark their customer services and were competing to generate better customer services. So I think that does lead to benefits and impact. You're right, that's not a citizen-driven one. I think to pull apart and clarify those different agendas, the agenda here around the discourse around citizens is precisely a critical response to the industry-driven smart cities agenda. So I think we'd probably be on the same side in that regard. I do think that there are some genuine criticisms of the open data movement insofar as reaching beyond those communities. Because what do we mean by communities? Do we mean neighborhoods or do we mean communities of developers and businesses, right? And reaching beyond those is a real challenge. And there's one point, I had a slide but I didn't use it, around open source culture. One of the challenges around open source culture and these bottom-up things is often communities speak to themselves, and it's those communities who are able to participate. So there's many challenges and fault lines running through, but I think what you'll hear on this panel are people who really are trying to create spaces for citizens to have a role.
And just to build on that, I agree. We're not changing the lives of millions, if not billions, of people yet. I think what we're doing is recognizing that the big bang top-down approach isn't the best way to do it. And as we change that, it's really a movement that is requiring grassroots, roll-up-the-sleeves work in every community. And I think that's if there's any message that I want to give, it's that if we're really serious about this, that's what we need to do. And it's models like this, it's models that countless other organizations are putting together to kind of do that. And hopefully eventually we'll come up with a standardized approach that will be able to sustain and really transform on a broader scale. But for right now, I think we're really feeling our way through this process, and a bunch of us trying to figure out different ways to do it, and then eventually we'll kind of, like most movements, come towards some agreement and then move and scale rapidly.
Great. We're now coming to our panel, and something that was said by Drew, by Chris, is about this idea of the laboratory, and particularly around the area of governance, how actually, governance of the cities actually change. I'm here joined by John Wanderlich from the Sunlight Foundation, who has extensive experience on dealing with, a new program basically, and extensive experience with dealing with transparency, but in particular a new program on municipal transparency, on local government transparency. And I am wondering up to which extent, governance of the cities, in the States are actually changing.
Sure. So thanks. John from the Sunlight Foundation. For most of our 7-year or so history, we've been focused on federal U.S. transparency issues through the lens of technology. And it's really very recent that we have a pretty significant and systematic approach on open data in American cities. And so when we were confronted with that new opportunity and to try to think through how to create more open data in U.S. cities, we have this difficult question: how do you scale an advocacy approach, whether you're 1 person or 3 people, or even if it was 50 people, to a country with 20,000 cities? So we had that's a really significant challenge, and so we did a lot of strategizing, and I think there are a couple approaches we decided on. One is there's a huge potential to be opportunistic when you're dealing with a amount of cities that large. And we face basically an unlimited amount of demand. We could throw as many people as we wanted at answering the phones and answering emails and making recommendations to cities that are just asking for help with their new policy. It is nearly unlimited, the amount of demand that we have, just from being, I don't know how people, maybe we should ask how they find out about us in the first place, whether it's a Google search or what, but it's an enormous amount of demand from cities saying we're passing a new open data policy, or we are revamping how we collect or disclose X data set. So that's one part of our strategy, but of course that would be, to rely entirely on just fulfilling that demand would be a bit scattershot. So we had to define a strategy for how we're going to approach these issues systematically. One of the early assumptions we made, or early decisions, and this strongly reflects the first two speakers, is that we were not going to focus just on the obvious cities where things were happening, and that would be New York and San Francisco and Chicago come immediately to mind, or Seattle. And we're active in those cities, but another point about urbanism in cities in the U.S. is that, I want to get this statistic right, 80% of U.S. cities have populations of less than 10,000 people. So we made that realization and made a big chart about it. So again, 80% of cities in the U.S. have less than 10,000 people. So that's a huge number of cities that have 100 or 1,000 or 3,000 people. At the same time, the top 10 the top 25 American cities have about 10% of the U.S. population. So we think of it as, population centered along the coast and a few big cities, but compared to where people actually live, the population, at least in the U.S., is spread very much throughout the country in small and medium-sized cities. So if we're talking about impacting a large population, that needed to be a big focus for us. So the day or two of data analysis we did to do that really helped us to prioritize and say our recommendations need to be able to be generally applicable to the population at large who do not live in Chicago or New York. The other thing that we wanted to do is to say, as we're approaching open data, that we want to be able to be confident in our recommendations. And we have a lot of experience working on open data on the federal level. We've deepened our open data policy guidelines, which went from 10 basic principles to something more like 40, with a paragraph of advice and collected best practices and a map that shows you where each one is, and we're tracking every open data policy. So we're dealing with open data policies at large, but then beyond that, we wanted to dive into substance. So we started doing something that we called data deep dives. And so what we're doing is every month or every 2 months, going in enormous detail into a specific issue area. We've done zoning and crime and lobbying, and we're working on campaign finance right now. And for each of those issue areas, we say, how is this information currently disclosed? What's the best? What's the average? What are some failings that are common? And then after that, we look and say, what does this information empower? When you have good access to zoning information or campaign finance or lobbying or whatever it is, what kind of analysis is based on that, and what kind of reuse or journalism or investigative journalism is empowered when people have good access to that information? Now, that's not quite citizen demand driven, but it's at least looking at transparency through the lens of the impact that it has on the world. So we collect our favorite stories about investigative journalism, or our favorite apps that let you visualize unused properties in Chicago, and say, okay, these are the kinds of things that we want to empower. And then the last step is to say, as a result of that, what policies should change in cities across the country to empower that kind of reuse of the data. So that's our strategy.
That's great to hear. I'm wondering how this is in the global south, and we are joined here by Silvana Fumega from Argentina, who has been looking at particular cases in the region, particularly Buenos Aires. So I was wondering, up to a point, how governance is changing or not in the south.
Hi, everybody. I'm Silvana, and I just want to make a few points. I'm going to be very brief, don't worry, Fabricio. No, I'm part of a research program that is called Opening Cities, and we are looking at 3 main cities in the southern corner of Latin America: Montevideo, Buenos Aires, and Sao Paulo. My role is basically researching on Buenos Aires. So I wanted just to point a few things related to Buenos Aires, but it could be applied to many other districts in the world. I mean, the case of Buenos Aires is a big city. It's not a middle-sized city, as they were mentioning. but in the context of a developing country with high levels of corruption, there's also informal institutions, there's also lack of transparency, so there are a lot of issues there to think about. So if we were talking about engagement, cooperation, participation, for what I've seen so far in the city of Buenos Aires, there's a lot of communication between the open data community and the people in charge of the open government office. However, if we are thinking about real participation of people besides this group of people, we need to think about politically important information. And so far, open data initiatives in cities has proved to be very useful in terms of providing information about services that the city provides. We are talking about transportation, cultural activities, and those kind of information. However, in terms of one of the main goals of open government in any place, national government, federal, or in this case in local government, is thinking about transparency towards accountability. In that case, I'm talking here about the city of Buenos Aires, but it's not just about Buenos Aires, it's about any other example of open data initiatives in the world, not only in cities. But the information in terms of relevant, important issues are not openly available in these data sets. So I think there's a need to think about how to update the right to information legislation to include these kind of things, because if not, we are depending on the goodwill of governments, and it's okay, but there's going to be things there that as citizens we need to know, and we are not going to be able to find in data set proactively provided by governments. So basically that's the point. There's a lot of effort, there's a lot of work, there's still a lot of communication between some groups in the cities and the officials in charge of these initiatives. However, we need to think about ways, especially in information environments that are not so developed, like in the case of Argentina and many other developing countries, how to be able to access open data or reusable data in other type of information, other type of topics.
That's great. And as we heard, I mean, kind of this, if you want, balance between, or imbalance, if you want, into the activities that we are seeing in the global north and the global south, and the challenge that it still is about accountability and transparency for open cities. I was kind of thinking of moving more into the kind of service delivery side and check exactly how this is happening. And we're really lucky here to be joined by a civil servant who is now essentially in charge of a program in Mexico, essentially dealing with public sector innovation, who is Pablo Collada. And so I understand you can be occasionally being hammered on the accountability side, but also would like to hear how this agenda is helping cities as well to advance innovation.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much, Fabricio. Thank you, everybody. It's been quite a couple of very intense days, certainly, hearing a lot of different concepts. Actually, that's one element I'm quite a bit overwhelmed by. The great concepts that have been presented throughout these 2 days, and as a public servant, you well said, sometimes it's difficult for us to understand the way you translate that great concepts into the participation or the specific activities that public servants have. In those terms, I'm part of this new government institution, this new area of Mexico City government. Let's say that Mexico City is a city of more than 13 million people, and part of an urban area of more than 22 million people, so it's quite a large animal. And this new area was created that's called Laboratorio para la Ciudad, Lab for the City. It's a laboratory, as some of the previous fellow presenters said. It's a lab to experiment on the relationship between the government and the citizens. And in the terms that you were talking about, Fabricio, I would like to present this idea that when you talk about government, it's not this abstract entity or this monolithic entity as some of the, in several panels have been talked about. It's a space where thousands and thousands of public servants act every day, with serious limitations. And I would like to think of the idea as we have been working on the open government strategy for Mexico City. And one of the greatest challenges that we have is to speak with these thousands and thousands of public servants. And I would like to think of the importance of having smart citizens that promote the actions of a new relationship between government and citizenship, but also to talk about smart public servants, which are these public servants that are more empowered, that have better information, that have better tools, that are more empathic of their citizens and of their fellow public servants, which is like a very important thing. We have managed to do some kind of encounters where we get together different public servants from different entities and talk amongst each other, to share their ideas, to share their projects and programs, and see the ways to collaborate. In that sense, for me to think as a public servant, to promote and facilitate better spaces for these public servants to be smarter public servants is a priority. So we think we need to give them better skills to think about open source, open data, open government concepts, and have them just experiment on better ways to make all these huge concepts about open city, open data, to make them really accessible for the citizens that they're working for.
That's a great point about, in a way, capacity building, but in a new way, basically, and a new way of engagement inside government and also in the relationship with citizens. And that's very interesting because, in a way, we have here on the other side of our panel, Marlene, who is driving a lot of innovation in the Netherlands with her organization. And I was wondering about this relationship you are building with local governments, and also the ways you drive forward your own work. And I would like to explore about that in this panel.
Well, I do some. I recognize the question that you need also smart civil servants, and that you, without real connections with people within government, you can't really move. You really have to have your allies. And I think that's also where open data comes from. It's from civil servants that took the courage and started to partner with people from civil society to do the first steps, to organize the first hackathons before it was really policy. So I think that kind of allies are very, very important, and we should not underestimate the difficulties that people have within their bureaucracies and their organizations, governmental organizations. But there are a lot of other challenges at the moment, and I think what I would like to share with you is maybe to make it even more complicated. And
that's good, we like that.
add another challenge to you in governments, because if you have open data, well, I mean, that's, of course, a lot of people, we are still struggling with it, and it's still a question like what data is open and what's not open, and then you can lie with data. So how are we interpreted data? So you also have the whole discussion about what are the economic models? What are the algorithms that are being used to interpret it if something makes sense, if it's economic viable? So we will enter a new discussion very soon about the open algorithm and the open models. So that will be a more complicated step that we have to into. And then we go into more the discussion like how are the technologies open or not? We as WAAG have been very much involved in the open design movement and this, the makers movement that has this mantra, if you can't open it, you don't own it. That also counts for products. It also counts for telephones like this kind of nice gadgets we have. We don't know how they're being produced. We don't know who is being paid or not being paid in the process. We do know that there are conflict minerals in this material. That there are conflict minerals in. So how do we can get rid of this kind of? How can we be transparent about also our products around us? But that's of course a question between the consumer and the market, the producers. But there's also policies that say that we all need smart meters. It's the European Union that said for sustainability reasons, and energy consumption reasons, we need smart technologies in our house. So it implies that all the energy companies or the network companies are now putting smart meters in the house. Before 2020, around 300 million of those smart meters have to be implemented. In most countries, this is already happening. I think in Italy, almost 60% already have a smart meter. But we started to discuss the whole concept of the smart meter with our network company, Alliander, in the Netherlands. And they opened up because of the fairness of the meter. If you are a contractor for, well, in the Netherlands, millions of those stuff, you could ask, how are they being produced? It's a quite interesting question. But the second question was even more important. Why is this data being extracted from our households? So how can we trust a company that takes all our data out of our house? What is the whole fairness of the data transaction? And I think that aspect of smart cities we not even have approached yet. I think this is one of the first steps to do that. Actually, I have two images to show you that we started to go and look into what is a smart meter. So actually opening up the technology that's being implemented in our houses under the whole concept of smart cities. It's no rocket science, actually. We had to sign a non-disclosure, which is really funny that they put technology in our houses. We're not allowed to look into the technology itself, which is already like, how transparent is this? But the second step is that we started to make a fair meter initiative, and we will sign a green deal with our minister to see if the Netherlands can, and not only the Netherlands, because this is a European issue, and I guess maybe in other countries we have the same problem, if there also can be a proposition that it's a fair meter in the sense of fair data and data protection. Is it encrypted? Not at the moment. Are there other solutions? Can we design other solutions so that the citizen is smart in using its, in this example, energy consumption, without selling or giving its data to another company? And there are totally different design solutions for that. So to me, the whole concept of smart cities and smart citizens is really engaged on a level that you, maybe you can show the next, to engage on an even deeper level also in designing this kind of technologies that are part of the smart cities rhetorics. And that we go into the, so we were at the Utility Week, which is a great event where all the shiny new products of all the utility companies is. And we had this boot camp where we sort of putting off, well, you saw how we demolished the smart meter. They were all, for the first year that we were there, they were all very frightened. Like, what are these people doing? They're making, they're not doing nice stuff with this technology. This year they already were partners, so they're now partnering in the Fair Meter Initiative. And I think it's possible also to first make this sort of engagement, design engagement with the civil servants and asking them to participate in reframing and redesigning the concept of smartness in cities, but also engage with private companies and really start also with the same type of sort of the willing within the companies to realize that they also can do better than they do at the moment.
That's pretty good. So there's this balance between how a new kind of engagement, if you want, with the public service in terms of regulation and in terms of co-creation and designing. So that seems like a great challenge. Now, coming back to the Global South, I mean, from the civil society perspective, Indonesia presents essentially if you want, a radical different perspective on the matter about the challenges you face and the stage you are actually, as Malin put it here, like they're talking about co-design, they're moving there in that direction, which is highly positive. But what is your current situation? Where are you standing right now?
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Like you all know about Indonesia, they are small in the map, but actually the big in in the reality. We have a lot of islands that have a lot of cities. It is over 5,000 cities around Indonesia, and then all the population that offer from 2,030 million. 57% is centered in the Java, so it will be crowded in the city of Java. And our challenge is there are still a lot of remote area that can reach easily. So we have taking more challenge to bring the smart citizen or how to improve them to get more have power, knowledge, and even how to implementation the technology on its cities. Because there are another challenge that internet can go access to every cities in Indonesia. So it is another challenge for Indonesia to bring smart cities. This is an opportunity for us in the future, and we hope in the future we can bring step by step, go from the simple technology to bring a citizen being smart to use technology and to access the information. And we also have engagement with the government in each local area to bring the technology and to bring the the information to be published. And fortunately, yeah, we're lucky we have a law as an umbrella to bring and access information. And then, yeah. Today, there are so many initiatives come from the government and also from the civil society to make the citizen. You agree that we should start from the cities because it is a small area that have many stakeholders like government, business, and community, academics, to bring them together to make the cities open what happened on there, and the people can access all the information and get the better service on there.
That's good. It's certainly a big challenge. I would like to step back for a moment and ask David Sasaki, who is working with the media network in Latin America, as well to provide a strategic outlook of the field, how media is engaging, and actually his own views in this, as David has long been involved in policy and cities from a media's perspective. And you probably can follow his blogs as well on these issues. But David, what is your view from a more strategic point of view? Where are we heading here in terms of open cities?
It's very difficult for me to speak of the strategic outlook for the sector because it's very difficult for me to define the sector. And I think that's something that we've heard a lot about through today and yesterday here at Open Government Partnership. And a related question is probably, why are we speaking about cities at all at Open Government Partnership when it's an event with federal governments or representatives from federal governments and civil society organizations that mostly focus on federal issues? And I think that the great achievement of the open government movement and sector is also its greatest point of tension, and that is that it brings together an innovation group, mostly a technology sector, that works on resolving very specific problems. That's what they're really good at. They say, what is a problem and how can we provide a solution to fix it? And then an accountability community that looks at government and says, what is the gap between what a government should be doing and what it actually is doing in practice, and how can we narrow that gap? And Open Government Partnership and the whole sector in this movement that we're a part of says, okay guys, let's get together, let's have a big party, and let's figure out how we collaborate. And we're still really struggling to figure out how we collaborate. The reason I think that we're talking about cities right now is because the innovation community developing solutions for problems that face individuals, which is I think what makes them most passionate, the problems of individuals tend to be around public services. So we can all test this theory by going back home with our families or our girlfriends or friends and start talking about open government and see when they get interested and when they get bored. And when we start talking, at least when I start talking with my friends about, well, what I try to do in my work is improve the quality of schools, then they get it. When I say, it's about budget accountability, then they start to fall asleep or they start looking at something else. So I think that this is an opportunity within cities to ground the conversation about how this field helps specific individuals around aspects that are related to their day-to-day lives. And most of those aspects of government around public services, so I'm talking about education, I'm talking about health, the provision of water, public transportation, are managed at the city level. And it's also where there are most points of contact between citizens and government. And it's also where there's a scale of participation that's rational. If you are a senator in most countries and you are responsible to represent 35,000 constituents, it's very difficult to manage that scale of participation. So I think that's some of why there's interest in this field of cities, which unfortunately we've kind of stuck to this label of smart cities, which none of us like, though we keep repeating it. And I think one of the reasons why we don't like the label is because it mostly comes from big industry, which are selling solutions to governments, mostly to big cities. And so that is to resolve the problems that resolve the problems that governments have, and not necessarily resolve the problems that citizens have. So when we talk about bottoms-up innovation, I think it goes back to what the gentleman from Indigo Trust said about how do we know where the citizen demand actually is. We have one grantee organization in Mexico, actually Alejandro Massa from Yo Propongo is here, means I propose. And they recently, Mexico City, like many cities, has to develop a master plan every 5 or 6 years when a new government comes in. And they led a consultation of, I think, around 25,000 people, 30,000 people, 30,000, and they kind of had this army of students go out with tablets, going out into all of the different neighborhoods and saying, what are your problems? What do you need government to resolve in your life? And I think that until we go out there and ask people proactively, how can all of this help you in your individual lives, rather than assert that we have an idea of what data you need, I don't think we're really going to resolve the issues of individuals.
Thank you very much. There are 2 points in there that I think are crucial. One is sometimes the lack of a forum for this to be debate, and certainly, you know, up to which extent the OGP can contribute to that. And this idea, of course, of demand-driven, I mean, what happens in cities is actually, it seems, is where the action is where the obvious things to happen in this field are going to happen. I would like now that we have about 15 minutes or so, to open the floor to the public and see if you have comments or questions about what you have heard from our panelists and speakers. There's one gentleman over there, the lady over there. We have 2 questions.
Sorry, I'm just going to squeeze.
Thank you, panel. Mark Robinson, DFID. The panel is unified in its criticism of smart cities and advocates smart citizens. But is there not too much emphasis on citizens and not enough on smart institutions in cities? And I would like to hear a little bit more on whether we have the right institutional fabric in cities to deal with the complexity of problems that city managers now have to address, together with the multiple demands being placed upon them to respond accountably and effectively to those multiple demands. So is there not a need for a better balance between enabling citizens to organize smartly at the level of problems that affect their day-to-day lives, but also supporting smarter institutions to deal with complex and multiple problems, such as, for example, environmental resilience, which is a huge problem affecting many cities in low-lying coastal areas, for example. So I would advocate more balance in terms of thinking of where smartness should lie.
Right, someone would like to take on that question?
Well,
Anyone?
I'll just start, and then
Malay and Pablo.
So I'm struggling just a little bit because I'm both a recovering government person as well as as a development person, as well as a private sector person. So I mean, I have all of these things going through my head. But I think I'm a pragmatist. And so what the model that I proposed, it doesn't have to be perfect, but what it does do is I think, bring together the various institutions, the ecosystem, fancy word, you know, for all of the pieces and the players within the city. And I think every city or every state or every jurisdiction is going to approach it differently. But I think from my perspective, if you bring those people together, those organizations and institutions to the table and get them to simply start talking to each other, I think that's a very basic but fundamental goal. As far as the smart institutions, I think that's really what we're trying to do through the model. And so in countries like the United States, for example, there's this concept of presidential innovation fellows, where bringing into government the people that wouldn't normally be there from the private sector or from think tanks or whatever, in order to bring a whole new set of ideas into the institution, marry them with people within the institution who are willing to change, which isn't always everybody, and really kind of create that engine for change within the organization. So I don't doubt that we need a better type of institution, but until that happens, all we're trying to do is bring the existing players together and get them to work together with the citizens, which hasn't been the case for a long time, to really do the co-creation of solutions and to move it forward that way.
Marlene, would that go?
Yeah, I second that. I think it's really about, I would say everything which builds institutions, it's almost immediately dies. So I would see it, and I think your model could work as, I mean, the whole term of living labs, of course, is also a fancy word, which has been used many times, but I think in this case it has a reason, because it means living. It's a living engagement. It's a lively engagement between people. So we definitely need interfaces between the technology savvy people, which are both in the creative community, within the tech community, but also in the civil society movement, and the people that have huge responsibilities within both companies and governments. So, but you need these interfaces as something that is really fluid and not stuck into institutions immediately. So I would say, yes, programs, design programs. I would go beyond co-creation and say we are really actually designing our societies again. And we need to be all designers. We become designers. And policymaking is in a certain way designing your future. So, yes, I would go for that.
And I will probably go. Pablo.
Fast answer. I would say after working for many years in the civil society organizations, I finally said yes to an opportunity to work in government. You know? And actually, it's been quite interesting because this lab for the city area has worked as some kind of a consultant for other institutions within government, and actually more like a therapist in so many ways, you know? Trying to just listen to these people that just really struggle and they suffer with so many issues they have to solve. Obviously, serve as a therapist with citizens as well that don't feel understood, etc. So what we're trying to do right now is try to establish 3 basic parameters to work with government entities, also understanding that the government period for the people that work there usually, or at least in Mexico City, so 6 years. So you have 6 years to learn all what you have to learn, do all what you think that ought to be done, and then say goodbye, no? Because then the next administration will come. So we try to focus our activities with these institutions in 3 steps. It's like learn faster, serve better, and share more. No? Those would be the best elements for us. No? If it's something that takes too long to be implemented, maybe I'm not sure if it will get all the impact that we want. No? It's not, I mean, things will not have to be done really, really quick, but try to do them the fastest as we can. Serve better, try to understand the impact of your actions in a really concrete way. And if, as some people said before, if you have really good clues of the improvements that you've done, and share more, understanding that if you collaborate or if you don't, then the impact of your actions and your budgets and your relationships and also your political capital will be weaker, no, if you don't share. So those elements.
And our second question over here. And there's a third question at the back.
At the Americas Caucus session this morning, we heard from a Brazilian colleague say that approximately 80% of the hackathons produced were actually vanished. The products vanished after 3 years. And yet, continually throughout yesterday and today, we hear about open cities and open data, and hackathons are continually still on the table. Why are they still on the table if apparently this has been a strategy that has failed? Is it because that 20% actually do provide really incredible solutions, or how can we move beyond hackathons? It seems like they're the default option for open data, and I think that has become also a problem with the action plans, speaking about OGP. So many countries apparently just default open government for open data equals hackathons. And how can we move beyond that?
I can see Drew here, Merlin and John lining up.
We were talking about this earlier. You talk to many people and mention the word hackathon and their eyes will roll. It's very true that the hackathon model, I would say it is effective at doing some things, but it's not a total answer. And you've seen greater awareness around what else needs to take place. Hackathons are very, very good at bringing people together, doing early ideation, creating relationships, creating awareness, doing early stage prototyping. They do not deliver long-term solutions. So a lot of effort now, I think probably everyone here, is actually, well, what happens after that? I think they still have a very valuable role, but how do you give structured support to those really good ideas? How do you create sustainability so that ideas come out that can be implemented? And critically, going back a bit to the other point, it's not citizens or big institutions, it's both. Governments are very good at creating long-term resilient solutions. That's what they do really well. So we need to connect this bubbling bottom-up space with those institutions that can put the resilience and the long-term solution in, whether they're government or private.
John?
I just want to point out that there's an inherent good in having people get together and be civically active, regardless of whether a community emerges or a successful product. And also, if 20% of the projects at hackathons are successful, I think that's probably a really good number. Sometimes projects are successful that emerge from them, and perhaps people have oversold the products coming out of hackathons. But if 20% of policy meetings resulted in new infrastructure with civic data, like we should never sleep again, and just that's really incredible. So I don't think that's all bad.
Ali?
That's what the point of
And we have Chris over there as well.
Well, I think, let me just say that, and I think I'm one of the first people that brought up the word hackathon. I think we did use them as an example in our model. And hackathons don't have to be all about creating apps for smartphones. They can be about coming up with ideas for new products or services or the delivery of services. And I think in the example that I gave in Colombia, that's actually what came about. It came about with the idea that we could actually have citizens, students in this case with iPads, actually go around and check on the progress of construction in the city and actually act as human sensors and human sources of information back to the city so the city could better track the delivery of construction projects, but also from transparency, make sure that the contractors were doing what they were saying they were doing and the city was actually paying for. That's not a shiny app. That's actually an idea that came out of the community with a solution out of the community that involved all of the players. So I agree, we do oftentimes focus on too many apps, the shiny thing. And I think hackathons can be used from a range of things, from better problem identification to actually better service delivery.
We got 3 questions from the audience. We're going to take them all together. So at the back over there, and then the gentleman over here, and then the gentleman over there. In order we collect these 3 questions, and then we split them here in the panel.
Thank you. Lenny Wild from the Overseas Development Institute. We're a research institute based in the UK. It still feels like I wonder if sometimes we are talking about cities in a fairly static sense, whereas actually in the countries where I work, in parts of the East and to some extent West Africa, you've got these processes of very rapid urbanization, right down from the development of very small cities and towns to a few cases of these mega cities. And I wonder what we're learning about how to do some of this more networked, sort of smarter approaches in contexts which are essentially in rapid transition change and where populations and citizens themselves are in flux and on the move.
Great. And the gentleman over here.
Thank you, Louis Saint-Arnaud from Foreign Affairs Canada. I would like to have someone of you situating a bit privacy sensitivities in all these among your issues. Perhaps the example of the smart meter is prompting my question, because recently in Canada there has been a controversy where a company owning landline, cell phone, TV cable, and internet provider has been saying publicly that in the marketing angle that that company is also offering all those data for other purposes. One can appreciate the transparency, but now the issue of big data in this context is going public and triggers knee-jerk reaction about this. Now, as you are developing open citizenship and smart citizenship, how do you factor this?
Great, and the third question at the end. At the end, the gentleman over there.
Hello, Jose Hernandez from Madrid. I wanted to ask, I heard a lot of labs, like working labs, like urban labs. And I was wondering, where are the results of these labs and how can we help, like taking the information and the results?
Okay, so who wants to tackle the first question about cities in transition, about essentially how essentially this new, Drew, Chris, or?
Sure. I think the model that we're proposing, and let me just say it's a model we're proposing. This is a new field, and we're all trying to figure out how to solve this. And so I don't mean to suggest that we have the perfect model. But I think the model that we're proposing is just as effective in some of the small to medium cities that I described as in Africa, where I just was this week, as some of these cities or governments that are facing this rapid urbanization. And I think the issue really is helping the government understand those four things that I described, or the ecosystem that I described. The fact is that the problem of urbanization and the challenges that come with it are just overwhelming a country or a city that already has challenges with capacity. And so just getting them over the concept that they have to be the person who solves it, that they are somehow failing, if not, that trust to get over the idea that they have to be the sole provider of the solutions, I think is absolutely important. And then the idea of letting go and inviting others into the conversation. I think those two things, or those 4 points, are the hardest for governments to do. And what we try to do at the bank is work with countries, to work with states, to work with cities, to basically use examples from all over the world, including the Songdos and the Singapores. And I don't want to bash those kind of top-down models. They're very effective in certain cases. But I think use that to kind of break down some of those barriers and introduce the concepts and get people comfortable with it. And we are indeed doing that in many of the countries that I know you're aware of in West Africa, and working with them to try to do that.
Right, and moving on to privacy, maybe you were directly alluded.
Yeah. Actually, just one remark on the model. I think it's the OECD that had a model called the triple helix. And especially a city as Amsterdam followed up to their advice and started to make a whole economic board consisting of knowledge institutes, the government, and companies. And we're trying to persuade them to make it a quadruple helix, so to put society and citizens on board. So I will tell now it's a World Bank model, so they can follow another big. Because I totally agree with you. Yeah, I think the whole question about is our data secure and and the whole concept of privacy, is it still possible, considering the amount of data that we put in Facebook, and we are not aware what Google knows from us. And so I think a lot of people are acting very open about themselves without having any idea what the consequence could be on the long run. And we share all this information with companies. We don't make a real fuss about it. So that's strange, but when the government does, we make a lot of fuss about it. So we are very, very angry when the government does something with our information. So I think this is a very ambiguous thing, and I think we have to discuss this. I have to be much more aware of what actually companies are doing with our information and how open and transparent is the data within Facebook and Google and others. What is the algorithm of Google, for example? It's like the recipe of Coca-Cola. It's secret. So there's a few concepts. You could say we all should learn how to use encryption. But then encryption is not really very user-friendly. So it's a real design question again. Could the interaction designers come in and to help us to make our messages encrypted, email encrypted, SMS encrypted by default? But that's a really design technology issue. But really, I think that's one way to go, because then you would not have to be very. Then everybody can have a certain security in their communication. But what you definitely want is that if a government is putting technologies in our lives, like transport cards, electronic patient records, identity documents, all this kind of digital stuff. They really should have a real encryption policy there, and it's not there yet. It's not so. The technology savviness within governments that are sort of asking companies to make this kind of technologies should be really raised, and this whole awareness should be much bigger.
And the last one, Pablo, can you take on that one?
Yeah, sure. I think there are a couple of questions of possible answers there. One has to do with the importance of systematization of the processes. I think that it's super important to have a very, very detailed systematization of what you do as a lab, no? And being able to, afterwards, accept something that for politicians it's really, really hard to accept, that you can be wrong, no? And that's for the structure of these laboratories, it's important to assimilate that idea, no? That you will have an idea, share this idea, do something about it, systematize what you're doing, and afterwards evaluate, no? And not only by yourself, but with other entities as well. And accepting that you can be wrong, and it's okay to be wrong in different to other public institutions who are super, super strict and they have to be right all the time, or at least that's how they seem to be. But accept that you can be wrong and that you have the opportunity to redefine the process, understand why you were wrong, and try again. That's like part of the idea. No? And obviously try to be open in these issues. No? And if you were wrong in certain terms, just open the analysis and the facts why you were wrong, and try to see if somebody else has a better idea or a better way to just addressing that issue. And I think that's important to be really humble as a civil servant once again and ask.
Yeah, that's great. So we heard about issues of a new vision around open cities. We also heard about different views on how governments are engaging in this process and the challenges that they have, and also issues about privacy and the role companies do play in this. And in a way, we also heard about the need maybe in this space to have a sort of forum where we could discuss further the idea of smarter cities and the models we need to engage. We also saw different realities from the global north and the global south, and I guess that the obvious conclusion is that we still are looking for answers and models, and as we try, I mean, we are probably getting it wrong at some stage, but with some luck, we could get something right. And there is enormous potential for collaboration at a global scale, particularly between small and medium cities. That's something that the panel seems to have addressed as well. And issues of governance will be always issues of governance, and when you take it to the local level. So I thank all of our speakers and panelists who have been tremendously generous to come here today, and I thank you all for this panel. And I would like you join me in thanking them with a round of applause. Thank you very much.